Hello, welcome to our thought leaders session about the AR regime. And joining me today, I've got two huge experts with deep knowledge of the industry, so this promises to be a good discussion. My name is James Hogbin. I'm the CEO of Fingerprint Supervision. We provide policy-driven communication supervision tools for effective reg host compliance consultants, directly regulated firms to keep themselves on the right side of the rules when it comes to communication supervision. Joining me today, who are true industry experts, at the top of the screen for me anyway, and I'll start with her, is Sarah Jackson, who is a senior regulatory consultant at DWF Law. Sarah.
Hi, yeah, so I'm from DWF Law. DWF provides legal and regulatory services, but I work in the regulatory consulting team, specifically focusing on the wealth management and IFA sector. We support in a number of areas, ad hoc projects such as regulatory due diligence, but also application for authorization and ongoing support with ongoing compliance projects. I've been in compliance for over 25 years. So I've seen a lot of regulatory change across that time and across various regulators, actually, as they come and go. And at one point, I also worked in compliance for a network overseeing 91 AR firms. So some experience in the AR regime in my dim and distant past. But obviously, it's an ongoing regime. So, yeah, still current.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I'm also joined by Shazana Begum, who's an independent regulatory consultant who, well, why don't you introduce yourself rather than me doing it for you?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Shaz, as told. I've been an independent consultant for just starting up a little while now, but I've been a regulatory consultant for about 6.5 years. Got experience doing lots of onboarding and ongoing monitoring of ARs and for a principal that I used to work with, and also regulatory compliance for firms trying to get FCA authorization and ongoing compliance monitoring of the regulations when you're authorized. Specifically, I've been doing the credit and payment sector, so everything to do with GRC and AML within those two sectors.
Lovely, thank you. So these are the very, very expert panel members that we've got today, and I think we should start just by outlining what we all think the AR regime was, what it's become, how the FCA are viewing it, and where we think it's going in the next couple of years. Sarah, why don't you lead us off with what's your definition of the AR regime and how the regulators are looking at it?
Well, from the regulator's perspective, I think it's all stemmed from the high level of complaints that are levelled against the AR firms. So I think a greater proportion of complaints are against ARs rather than directly authorised firms, which leads to questions around the oversight that is in place from the principal firms, how much control they had. I know when I was going out to see our network firms, part of our monitoring, once a year, we had to go into the office of the AR. Every single AR we had to go and visit. We could get in and we could sit in their teams. We could hear what was going on around us. We could see how the office functions and we could see how they operated, especially when clients walked in. You know, if they had a shopfront type office, we could, see that going on. And I wonder these days how much of that actually happens. Some of the principals have huge numbers of ARs. Some of them we know have got over 1,000. Now, if the FCA are looking at a ratio for oversight of, say, 1:5, that means a compliance team of, 200 plus. That's not going to happen. But actually, how many times do they physically go and see these AR firms, whether they be individuals or multi-advisor firms? How often do they have face-to-face interactive communication with them? How do they know what's actually happening on the floor?
specifically there, you're talking, I guess, about retail, right?
Yes. That's my background, and that's effectively my market at the moment, retail. Yeah. So whether that's investments, mortgages, insurance, whatever it may be, but yeah, consumer-driven retail.
And where do you think? So, in my mind, there's two areas, right? There's wholesale and there's retail. So retail covers payments, credit, IFAs, people that need retail permissions, and wholesale covers, I don't know, venture capital funds, PE, broker dealers, hedge funds, as people would call them, that don't need a retail permission. Historically, the FCA seems to have lumped them together, but I think they're trying to tease them apart. Shazana, given the last policy statement, where are you seeing the split on that?
So it's interesting. I think if I go back to like the beginning of like the whole regime, when it started in 1986, it was a very small regime. There were only 97 principals with about 2,500 ARs. Now there's about 35,000 ARs and 2,900 principals. So the growth in this sector has been exponential. And now the regulator's kind of catching up to all the harms that have been created. So there's been two thematic reviews previously in the insurance and investment sectors in 2016 and 2019. And those showed that there was, not enough oversight of ARs. There wasn't enough monitoring of the risks, and that created harm to consumers. The FCA have said that in terms of, like Sarah has also alluded to, the FSCS claims, principals and their ARs amount to 61% of the value of FSCS claims. And that was between 2018 and 2019. I believe that was 1.1 billion. And then so principals account and their ARs accounted for 60% of that. Similar in terms of complaints, FOS complaints, they disproportionately higher, and they create disproportionately higher supervision works. That's why the FCA have put their focus here. Recently, the highest in terms of activity of ARs, consumer finance is the biggest area. And what I've seen lately actually is firms dropping their ARs in the consumer finance space because maybe there's trouble in oversight. So this is a little bit of conjecture in terms of oversight. But what I have seen is that consumer finance firms aren't using their permissions as much. It might have been, non-financial firms, things like retailers, automotive traders. They're using that. They had got those permissions, and then now the principals are actually checking to say, oh wait, you're not using them. So there's been a proper checking of who's using the permission and how, because of this data-led initiative from the regulator, and ensuring that the principal is having sufficient oversight of the activities, including are they actually doing this activity or not.
Sarah, are you seeing the same thing across your client base?
I think, to be fair, we're seeing that they are using the permissions they need. Actually, we don't come across too many cases where they have a lot of permissions that they don't use. Some of them have the peer-to-peer that was just added to everybody's registered entry, and it was never taken off. Some of them have pulled away from the DB pension review market and haven't necessarily brought their register permissions up to date because they don't know where they want to stay out of the market. So, there are considered decisions for keeping permissions in place. It's always something that we look at, when we do a piece of regulatory due diligence on a potential acquisition. What are you taking them on to do? What have they done in the past? And then, what has their principal done in the past? And you get to see fairly similar permission profiles across the piece, to be fair.
So what was interesting to me was in the last review that they did, the first thing that the FCA put up as an option was to just ban the whole lot. And so obviously they went out to the market and said, here are your options. Number one, ban everything. Number two, regulate them a bit. Number three, regulate them a lot. Number four, ban them. And from that, we've got the policy statement PS 2211 from August last year that seems to have teased apart principals and reg hosts. And I think that's the same in retail and wholesale. And to me, the fundamental wrongness of the concept was that the regulator is an absolute being. They sit there saying, yes, no, you can be regulated, you can't be regulated, we're looking after it. The layer underneath it has some permissions and then sort of rents them out to their ARs. And so therefore, what is an absolute is somewhat polluted by a commercial relationship. So some of the AR networks are saying, well, this is actually quite a nice revenue turn here to be able to charge these people to have their regulatory permissions to sell our products. Or as a reg host to say, yeah, we've got some stuff. We're just going to parcel that up to people that either couldn't get regulated, want to do it quickly, don't want the burden, don't want the onerous bit. And it's interesting to me that the regulator has allowed that to continue. Slightly contentious point, given it's the marketplace I sell into. Shaz, what's your opinion on that before I kill my entire marketplace?
So even though it's been allowed to continue, I think what they've done is actually, so it's great that they acknowledged the distinction, because before there was no distinction in terms of principals and regulatory hosting.
Sorry,
but because,
in case there are people there that don't know the nuance, could you
of
enumerate?
course, yeah.
Obviously, we all know, I think. I'm sure you two know, and I'm making it up. But Shaz, if you could let everybody know.
So what the regulators have done now is separated out the difference of principals, which is a regulatory host is still a principal, but within principal, a regulatory host is someone who's literally just got the permissions, but not actually doing the regulated activity themselves. And so they are selling the permissions essentially and getting an income from it. And that, from the FCA's point of view, has created problems because in a lot of the areas, the regulatory host may not have the expertise of the subject matter of the permissions that they are selling. And these can be, quite complex permissions between in the retail and consumer finance sector. And then it also creates, there's been, from what the FCA have said, lack of sufficient oversight of the ARs when they're doing that, and conflicts of interest because, what you're trying to do is generate a financial model here and not looking really deeply into the harms that may be created within that model because it's still, you've got to answer to your board and investors and keep the ARs going. And what there has been in the sector has been lots of high growth. So principals taking on, 1 year they've got 100, next year they've got 200 suddenly, and that they've grown massively, but their compliance oversight hasn't caught up with the growth of the ARs that they have on their books. And that's just creating more harm that the FCA want to now acknowledge, and through the data-led initiative and all the information that has to be given back to the regulator. And the things that we can expect from this year is, a lot more data requests from principals, including the regulatory hosts, including Section 165 data requests that they specifically outlined in those.
And Sarah, are you of the same mind on this, or do you have a different opinion?
Yeah, no, I think I'm very similar. I have a similar view. The regulatory host may not have the knowledge. They may also not have the ongoing and constant awareness of regulatory requirements. You're talking about non-product related issues like consumer duty, the oversight, the capital requirements. They may not have an understanding of what the AR should be doing, not just from a product perspective, but from a regulatory regime perspective. I think from my perspective, there's lots of pros for the AR regime.
Okay.
As long as it's managed.
It would be
the first one for the AR firm, it's cost effective. Regulatory fees, compliance costs, they don't have to worry about that too much. The firm may also be considering their role in the industry. They might be a new startup. They might just be testing the water. They might be newly qualified. They're not quite sure whether they want to go directly authorised and incur all of that time and effort and cost to get directly authorised. So they're going to try out and see how they succeed. Good place for that to happen, I think. Bit of a sandbox for them. And then from a resource support perspective, if they want to go into financial promotions, if they want to get the network name behind them, perhaps they work for a big familiar network name, they might like that on their correspondence.
Mm-hmm.
And then from compliance and T&C perspective, if they don't need to worry about their own compliance team, they can rely on the network to provide it for them.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Mm-hmm. The principal's got a place. I think there's a place for the model. It's just got to be managed. It's got to be run properly.
I think also, maybe we need to draw a line between retail and wholesale, because retail has, having once manufactured and sold structured products, I'm well aware of how retail works, has a lot more onerous conditions on what you can and can't do. Whereas wholesale, typically it's I hesitate to say Gucci end of the market, but it's the hedge funds, it's the people that have exited the desk at JP Morgan and want to carry on going with their sort of friends and family money or become slightly institutional and the rest of it. And I think the wholesale reg host market, I can't think of a complaint that's happened against the ones that we've been involved in terms of a customer complaint, because they're dealing with professional investors or eligible counterparties. They don't have retail permissions. They don't deal with that end of the market. And actually, because the FCA approvals process is so onerous and takes so long and is utterly opaque to a standard user, that if you're a high-flying hedge fund trader, the last thing you want to do is sit around for 18 months while some temp from the FCA decides and opines on whether you're any good or not. And therefore, the regulatory hosting market there is almost a byproduct of the FCA's hopelessness at regulating people or getting them on board to the regulatory system. Whereas I think in retail, it's more to do with, it's a cheap way for networks to get more sales resource in. Is that a fair assumption or not? Shaz, what do you reckon?
I think that's completely fair, because under the consumer finance permissions, a lot of the permissions that are used is the credit broker one. So, and what a lot of firms do is, they either they are the lender and then they all have the AR as a broker. So they're separating out risks and things like that. Or, putting loads of brokers on their permissions just because it's easier. It's an easy permission to sell out. But then that is an area that does have a high amount of FCA FOS complaints in the retail, because we've got the mortgage, we've got limited type of lending that ARs can do, and credit brokers. So the products in itself, and that because it is the consumer, or is maybe in the wholesale space, it's a different type of customer, and the consumer finance customer is the average consumer, a lot more vulnerable in who they are in terms of what they understand. And one of the things that the FCA said about the AR and principal regime is lack of clarity as well. Sometimes it's not known when the consumer is engaging with someone, who are they engaging with and what the responsibilities are. Are they engaging with the AR here? Are they engaging with the principal? Who are they really doing? What are the responsibilities? Because there's umbrella networks here and a lot of firms in the mix. So I think that's one to consider on being fair, clear, and not misleading in who you are, what your responsibilities are, and what they are to the customer.
And where do you think SM and CR runs across this? Because to me, it seems that if you're running SM and CR correctly, then effectively the ARs that you've got, it runs into their business. Yet that's not the typical hosting model. You host a person rather than a firm. Yet SM and CR would suggest that other bits of the AR firm should be regulated. Sarah, what have you seen any of that going on within your client base?
No, because we tend to deal with the principal, they're happy with the SMCR applying to them for their senior manager roles and their functions. And then obviously the principles under the approved persons regime, very similar, due diligence, due skill and what's the phrase?
Exactly.
There's not a great deal of difference between the core principles. If you comply with APA and take it a little bit further, you would get to the SNCR.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I think the SNCR should cover it all.
Yeah. Well, my point was that because of SMCR and the incredible scope creep that it's brought in, i.e. effectively the cleaner dinner lady and IT support guy isn't an SMCR, everybody else is, seemingly, if you read their examples. When you start taking on ARs, you're either seconding in a person from that AR and the rest of it, but that AR could have another 20, 30, or in consumer credit, thousands of employees. Where does that fit into SM and CR? Because clearly there needs to be some management that's going on and there's some risk happening. And it seems to me to be one of those things that I don't think they thought it through when they published it and went, we've got this senior management regime, because surely in each AR you've got the same management chains, management responsibility, yet there's no relationship given the way that ARs are structured. But
then defending the regulator somewhat.
Oh, God.
There is still the possibility of those, however many employees the AR firm has got, to interact with the consumer and cause that consumer harm and detriment and financial loss. Just because they're not subject to the SNCR, they're still having interactions with the end consumer and the client of the firm. If they cause harm and the senior manager at the firm is not aware of it, potentially the FCA need to bring those.
Yeah, but do you see the issue that the FCA have no remit whatsoever over the AR, just over the person that's in the AR?
But look at the number of complaints, though. There are more complaints against AR firms than there are against directly authorised firms.
Yeah, but that's a complaint against the principal, surely, rather than the AR firm.
Well, it depends what. No, it's not necessarily. It's against the AR. A lot of the ARs that we see have complaints.
But the AR is effectively the principal is the one that's regulated, not the AR.
Yeah, but the activity that's caused the complaint is against the AR. I'm a client.
Yeah.
I take advice from John Smith from AR number 1.
Yeah.
I complain because he's given me rubbish advice and I've lost money. But my complaint gets handled by the principal.
Absolutely. And the complaint should be against the principal as far as the FCA sees, because the AR has no regulatory standing.
Yes. But the AR is the person, the individual that did the that is subject to the complaint.
Which is where I think the whole logical thing collapses in on itself, given the fact that actually it's a complaint against the principal and the FCA should register the complaint against the principal and sanction the principal. Yet there seems to be this, oh no, it was the AR that done it. And they're only in SMF 30. Is that still a thing?
No.
Used to be a 30, whatever they are.
No.
If you look at the register, there's still a whole load of principals with CF30 permissions that either they haven't updated or the regulator hasn't updated.
Well, they have permissions for different advice types, don't they? So, yeah.
Yeah, I thought CFs had disappeared for SMFs. I didn't think
under the APA regime, there's a bit like they're still in the old. So SNCR doesn't go to the ARs because they're under the APA regime.
Yeah.
And so as long as they do the fitness and propriety under the APA regime and approved persons, and then what I would say is that under principals, what I've seen in the models I've worked is the principal will probably hold MLR, so SMF 16 and 17. Those are the compliance functions. And when they're holding them, they really need to understand the responsibility that goes along with that. You are responsible and you could be personally accountable for the misdeeds and of your ARs. So what we've traditionally seen where the harm has come from in the principal and AR model is a lot of ARs might do their own compliance. Compliance is laissez-faire, where, you tell me you're compliant, I'll tick it off. But now it needs to be, and what I'm seeing when I'm talking to firms who want to go into the principal and AR regime is, no, principal owns 100% compliance, as they always have done, but have taken a relaxed approach to it. And in terms of good practice of what I've seen is, where for larger principal models where they may have several ARs, utilizing RegTech to have a good record keeping process of everything. And one of the two main areas will be financial promotions and complaints. So any complaints, so first of all, you'd make sure everyone in the AR is really trained up, giving them initial training, refresher training on all areas of compliance, but particularly complaints, vulnerability, and what was the other one I mentioned? Complaints and vulnerability, and on the product itself, and then how to put those complaints back into and resolve them. So the principal needs to be doing root cause analysis on a micro and macro level of complaints, not just looking at a complaint in itself, but holistically. Are there themes running along these complaints? Are there themes running along your different ARs? And then making sure, and then a good practice I saw was every financial promotion has to be approved by the principal. Not left to the AR to just run on their own.
It can't be left to the AR, right? Because they're not regulated. So
it shouldn't be, but it shouldn't be, but a lot of principals may leave that. I've seen good practice where the principal approves every single AR. They'll go back and forth on several iterations, like, oh, can I have this word? No, you can't. Add the risk wording. Add it on this font size. Add it on this place right here in the middle of the page, not right at the bottom and hiding in the corner. And then that financial promotion gets approved, every single one. And I think that's really good practice in terms of monitoring just one area of risk, which is a high area of risk.
So what entertains me, having lived in the CISC handbook for about 15 years now, 10 years maybe, and knowing backwards the requirements for data retention, CIS 9.1, call recording, CIS 10A, and all of that sort of stuff, and the CIS 6 compliance officer access to all areas, etc., which binds everything, whether it's retail, wholesale, doesn't matter. Even if you're prudentially regulated, you've still got CISC obligations. We regularly go and talk to networks, principals, and reg hosts who have no rights over their AR data, even though they're saying, yeah, we're CIS 10, we're CIS 9.1. Yeah, you are, because you're regulated. Show us how you have the AR's data, because it's not the AR's data. They're seconded to you. It's your data, because the regulator's looking at you, not the AR.
That's a really interesting.
They can't get that.
That would definitely be down to the contracts and making sure that first of all, the FCA does expect a contract in place, and making sure that contract includes all of the regulatory responsibilities from the principal in terms of, we have access to your premises. You're going to want to go on to as Sarah as well said, have field agents to really look and see what's going on site. So
the FCA has right of access to your premises. So the principal in the contract has to have the AR give up rights of access to the FCA. Right? And a lot of contracts don't have that because the AR is regulated. So the FCA want to be able to turn up to their premises and take a look. I've not seen that in a lot of the contracts we've looked at, but more, we've not seen the data access. So if you're signing off complaints, if you're signing off marketing, if you're looking for patterns of behavior in communications or in trading or in the way that you treat your sales, what you do is you analyze the data, which is your data, because you're the regulated firm, you're the regulated person. And very, very few ARs and principals understand that. We've gone to them and said, right, show us your AR contract, because what we do is we analyze your data. And a lot of them don't have rights to the AR's systems, to the AR's data. And if the contract finishes, the rights disappear. And SIS 9.1 says you've got 5 years of retention there for critical business stuff. Now, wholesale do it a completely different way. Wholesale now collect all of the data themselves and have data repositories of everything that goes on. And it's an expensive thing to do, properly expensive, because you are taking the data for all of your firms and storing it away and analyzing it. And in retail, I'm constantly amazed when we see the agreements that SIS doesn't seem to exist in retail for ARs or principals. How do you, because you've both said, oh yeah, we go on site or we look at marketing reviews or whatever. If the FCA turned up and said, SIS 9.1, we want to see all the records, how would that happen in retail? Sarah, how would that happen in your client base?
I would expect, and it hasn't happened in our client base to the best of my knowledge, that the AR firm receives the visit, but they do have the systems and controls in place by the principal to say what happens on the day of that visit. So when they turn up at 8 o'clock in the morning, they have points of contact. The principal would have somebody who could get to that office and provide compliance support so that the FCA representative is met by somebody from compliance. I would not expect the AR to deal with it on their own. I would not expect them to want to deal with it on their own. I would expect them to be picking up the phone to say, oh, I've got somebody in the office, help. And they should be on the way. Now, how that happens geographically when they're hundreds of miles apart sometimes, I don't know. Teams, I guess, instantly rearrange the visit to some extent. Depends on the nature of the visit, obviously. But yeah, I would not expect them to
show us all of the communications between approved person A and everybody else. That's going to the AR and saying, can I have your data? And they go, oops, I've deleted it because I didn't know. In wholesale, that doesn't happen, right? The wholesale ARs and principals have that data because they've collected it. In retail, I don't know. I've seen a load of, we use Gmail. It's fine. And yet they're still in a network. They're still being AR'd. Yeah, all of our stuff, it's on a plug-in USB file drive in our office in Eastbourne. And actually, the AR is saying that's fine. The principal saying that's fine. We're compliant. And they're breaking 3 or 4 major SIS rules right there. How does that even become a thing?
Well, if they can access the information from their system, if they keep it in, the cloud, or they keep it on a specific network-driven IT tool, and they can access it, and they have the right to access it, they have the right to provide it. There's also the right of access to that data from the retail client's perspective. Does the engagement document does it include the wording that allows the principal to have access to that information, whether that's emails or...
But the moment it's regulatory data, the principal has access to it because the AR is seconded to the principal, and any communications is coming, therefore, from the principal, not from the AR's firm. Yeah. So therefore, the data is actually the principal's, not the AR's, because at the bottom of every email, it should say, this email comes to you with regulatory disclaimer, which is I think it's in Cons, Appendix A, where it says, this comes to you, we're umbrellaed by, we're an authorized representative of this firm with their FRN. So actually, the data isn't coming from the AR corporately, it's coming from the principal. And this goes into a whole load of right to be forgotten, subject access requests, and all the rest of it.
But also, really, as you said earlier, when they leave, what happens from a contractual perspective? Who takes that data forward? Because the client will want to stay with the AR.
Yep.
And I'm assuming the principal and AR agreement will say that the client is the ARs. So if the AR leaves, the principal is not going to keep the client.
No, but the principal should keep the data for 5 years.
Absolutely. And then how do they get around that data sharing going forward? There has to be something in the contract that allows that to happen.
Absolutely. And this is what I'm saying is I'm going in, I'm looking at these contracts and it's completely silent on this area, which is the regulator can come to the principal at any time within 5 years and say, show us your workings on that. And a contract goes, right, we finished the contract, we're off. So the principal has to go, well, actually, we don't have any of that data because we never took a copy because our commercial model didn't have the ability within it, because we only charged them 200 quid a month or 1,000 quid a month. We couldn't capture all of their data in our commercial model. And I think this is one of the weaknesses in retail. It doesn't happen in wholesale. Wholesale typically charge more and have proper high-end systems, such as ours. But when you get into retail, I'm just sitting there going, how can you do this for the money that you're charging? Because the regulations are the same, right? The CISC happens across all classes. Shaz, what have you seen in your clients around this?
So when I was as part of a principal in AR network, the principal had the right to access all data as part of that contraction. I think it's really important to understand what your regulatory obligations are in having access to it, and making sure that that is then carried down the chain into those contracts to make sure that you have access to that information. And now the regulator, both through this the new changes and the data-led initiative through the update, and also through consumer duty, really expects the principal to be looking at management information on a continuous basis. So they could be a separate entity where it's not part of your business, or it could be a distributor for yourself where they introduce you. So there should be a lot of communication between the principal and the AR about management information, going from every topic, really, from complaints to financial promotions to outsourcing to wind down planning. What's their wind down planning? What's their business continuity planning? What's their outsourcing look like? Who are they using? What communications are they having? Emerging risks. The risk register should be expansive, looking at emerging risks for the sector, for the permissions they're using, market trends, what kind of market risks will be emerging or have emerged, and really looking at all of that information and having access to documents, onboarding documents, and as part of that, the FCA also have said you need to do an annual assessment on the AR. So how can you do an annual assessment if you don't have the right to access to all of this data? You're going to need to be sampling and checking call scripts, interactions through chat box or post-sales interactions. When someone's said I'm vulnerable, what has happened after they've said that. So that data is really important, because the FCA have said you need to look at management information from this side and from consumer duty side, so they go hand in hand. And what they expect is the principal to just be eyes hawked down onto their ARs.
So the other thing that I found interesting from the policy statement was that the FCA expect principals and reg hosts to treat their ARs as employees. And I've worked as CTO for some financial services firms. And as a CTO, we put in various systems, procedures, whatever for our employees. Things like call recording, email journaling, scanning of instant messages for illegal, immoral, or fattening behavior, be that in high-end stuff, insider trading, or sales appropriateness, or language, or whatever. And if the principals have to treat their ARs as employees, two questions. Number one, to what remit is that? Because they do start talking about getting more into the firm of the AR. So all of a sudden, is the principal responsible for treating the whole AR firm as employees? And also, if I'm treating somebody as an employee, that's quite an expensive cost load, because I'm securing them. I'm making sure that all of their stuff is there and done. And I think that kind of blows the cost model of retail principals out of the water if they have to follow the treat everybody as an employee, because it kind of blows up the I'm becoming AR because I don't want the overhead sort of thing. Sarah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think I'd want to look at more about what does it mean to be an employee? What are they actually getting at? There are lots of elements of employees. Are we going down the line? Are we looking at the admin teams, or are we just looking at the advisors, those that have client-facing roles?
Well, the FCA said anybody, so all ARs should be treated as employees. And then in the next thing they said, and the principal is more responsible for other members of the firm as well as the appointed person. And that was in the policy statement PS 2211.
Yeah.
I don't think it's like SIS 10A all over again. It took a good 4 or 5 years before that people really realized that, oh my God, that's huge.
Yeah, it is huge. When you say it out loud like that, it's massive. And I'm sure that none of the principals I've dealt with under our work treat their ARs as employees.
No, clearly
I've
not.
Any evidence of that.
Yeah. And
they're subject to the principal policies around gifts and hospitalities notifications, which might be the same. Breaches, complaints, all of that kind of stuff. They've got no input into their holiday entitlements or their sick leave or their, how far does it go?
Well, so this is another great FCA one-liner that has massive implications on everything. And I think a lot of people after the policy statement thought, well, that's the FCA done with that. They're going to look at something else now. And everybody breathed a sigh of relief that they were still able to carry on doing the model. And that there was a nice big document with a few changes where they had to do an annual assessment and there's a form and off they go. And then a month ago, they came back out with all the data saying, we've recruited a team of 10 or 12 people to look at this. Here's all the data. We're back on it. And I don't know about the two of you, but we've certainly seen a lot more interest since the FCA have revisited their policy statement, which they don't typically do, right? They do a thematic and then ignore it for 5 or 10 years. Look at financial crime, last done in 2016, never revisited. So I think a lot of people have suddenly gone, blimey, they might be taking this more seriously than we thought. Shaz, what have you seen in your client base around that?
It's interesting. So the FSMA regime and principles in AR, obviously the whole policy statement came out and there was an overhaul to the regime. But what I'm seeing is that the lessons that need to be learned and implemented in the FSMA regime are trickling into the payments arena. So we saw Modular a few weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, being told to stop onboarding new agents and distributors. No context, not really. They haven't put out any statement or anything like that. But that is a big restriction on the register for all to see. You cannot put any new agents or distributors without the FCA's permissions. So what we're seeing is what were the lessons and regulatory requirements that need to be input into from the FSMA regime trickle into the payments, which operates on a parallel model with the principals and agents and distributors, but it's been not so much visited. And we also still have to wait for the results of the HM Treasury call for evidence input. And they're exploring the legislative changes that could be made. So there's still this is not shut. It's not it's very much an active area, and it will only get more regulatory scrutiny, especially on regulatory hosts who have the FCA have said will get more attention compared to principals who do not operate on that model. So that really means looking at how you're doing oversight of ARs and using, I'd say, the resources. I think we talked about a figure of what kind of resource you need. So for 5 ARs, 1 full-time employee, that's one that the FCA have said before, where they look for so that peers can compare on how many employees they have per an AR. And some of these AR models have hundreds of ARs. So do they have a sufficient amount of human resources to be monitoring these ARs, including when ARs have sudden growth in their revenue, looking at the risks that emerge from this. So making sure that there's resources both in human and technology to really oversee these ARs.
Sorry, Vince in the comments has refined what I was saying. I was being over generalist, as anybody knows me, I am. And he's pointing out that it doesn't say treat ARs as employees, just the same level of oversight. So effectively do the expensive bit for employees, because overseeing employees is all of the systems and material bits of it. But whichever way, principals and reg hosts are being asked to do the expensive bit, which is ensuring the systems work, ensuring that they're not forming cliques or effective bad sales practices or doing things they shouldn't. So the point remains that the cost has suddenly increased on all principals and reg hosts if they're going to follow that paragraph. Maybe they don't need to sign off their holidays and that sort of thing, but certainly they need to oversee them.
Treat as an employee, and then employment law is just, I think that
data and data law, which is interesting. Right, we've got a quarter of an hour left, and we've got a question we need to deal with. What do the two of you think is the near and distant future for the AR regime? Sarah, where do you see this all ending up over the next 6 to 12 months?
I think the regulator will consider what other MI they want to gather. At the moment, the Rep 025, that's going to become due in December, I believe, or from December. That's only capturing data on complaints and finances. There are lots of other pieces of MI that they could be collecting.
Mm-hmm.
I think from the annual attestation side, it's interesting that the principal is expected to review the AR's business, each AR's business, but also they're expected to review their own systems and controls for monitoring those ARs.
Mm-hmm.
So, once a year, they're going to be revisiting their own practices as well as the AR's practices. I think there will be a bit more focus on the oversight and the outputs from that oversight. I think there'll be some targeted investigations. I think as ARs want to move around to different principals for whatever reason they want to, as Shaz mentioned earlier, sudden increases or decreases in AR populations for a principal is going to come to the regulator's attention.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll just want more information. There'll be data requests here, there and everywhere, I think.
Okay,
the FCA have said they will use Section 165 to do those data requests as well. So you can expect, regulatory interaction with the FCA, and especially if you are a larger principal and regulatory host, you should expect interaction with the FCA, either for a data request on 165 or off the back of the data that you are submitting through the Rep 025.
And do we collectively think the regime as it stands can survive, or does it need to undertake fundamental change to be a thing? Because for me, it seems that on a cost basis alone, the principals can't deliver what they should be delivering in a regulated environment, given the fact that the fees are so low and the cost pressure on them, because there are a number of retail networks, are quite intense. And we get into the debate about commercialization versus regulation. I don't personally see how the model continues at the price it is. Is that something you see happening, or do you think that they're just going to have to get bigger and therefore better, or the market's in for a rude awakening when a principal goes, actually, it's not 500 quid a month, it's 5,000 quid a month because of the reg risks we've woken up to now?
I don't think it's to do with the reg risks. I think it's to do with their obligations. If they want to oversee properly and comply with the FCA's requirements, they need to incur the cost. And if they choose to pass that cost on to the ARs, then the ARs will need to understand why. They're still getting a benefit.
Yeah. They don't have to do it themselves, right?
Right. And there's a lot, don't forget the PII costs.
Yeah.
A little one on those probably can't afford a policy.
Yeah.
Firms will either have to, really think about the growth of how many ARs they have in their books. And I've seen firms really slow down on that. And because of the risk of what's going on here, really slow down and halt taking on ARs, or invest in the compliance oversight that's required. So if you have the money to invest, then and make sure you have sufficient oversight. And I think that point about how much to charge ARs is a really important one, because it's really expensive to get directly authorized, and it's really hard. It's very high threshold to get authorized now. So that's a selling point for principals. Like, if you want to try this on your own, see how far you get in trying to be directly authorized, because in the payment sector, it's about 10 to 15% approval rate. And that's very, very low. Approval rates have gone from 1 in 14 to being rejected to about 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 being rejected. So across the board, it's very hard to get authorized. So the principal and AR regime is the alternative. But even now, it's become all of these regulatory obligations have even made that hard, because you still have to go when you put an AR on your books, you still have to get it just approved through an FCA, and there's the chance that they will ask more questions about the business model. Have you reviewed the business model, the financials, done the fit and proper, what's going on here? So that charge point really just needs to be maybe thought of from the principal perspective, because it's worth more essentially.
Yeah. Sorry, just before we finish, we have had a question from Nick Wright, who says the FCA made it clear that considering further engagement with reg hosts, new rules, requirements, what are our views on the divergence that may happen between a principal and a reg host? Certainly, I think that because a reg host's only reason for being is renting out their stamps to people, they're going to see a much closer regulatory oversight than a principal whose principal job is selling mortgages or selling insurance or whatever. And they have a compliance department that does that, and they want to expand their sales force with ARs, but they've already got some compliance in how to sell financial products into retail. So I think, personally, reg hosts have got a cold wind of regulation coming their way, because they're not necessarily the sort of people that would be out there selling stuff. They just happened into some regulatory permissions and they're renting them out. Now, I draw a very dark line between wholesale, where regulatory hosts are there because the FCA is so hopeless at getting people regulated that it takes 18 months, costs a fortune, nobody wants to wait that long, and reg hosts are good. And retail, where, as we've covered, it's the price isn't there for them. So I think reg hosts are going to be closely regulated within the next year, whereas principals will just see a bit more information coming their way. What are the two of yours opinions on that question that we have? Sarah, why don't we go?
No, I think Shaz was going to go first, if that's all right.
Go with you.
With regulatory hosts, I think what you can expect as well is direct interaction with the FCA in terms of, okay, let's have a little meeting and see what's your skills and experience in mortgages. And if there is none, then it really calls into question, okay, so how do you review the MI, and how are you assessing, when something's going wrong? So whether you need to upskill, but would be kind of as well, or outsource the compliance, the manual compliance in terms of, okay, complaints have come through, what do we do here? So really the skills and experience in, if you don't have that, how are you reviewing the quality and doing quality assurance on the ARs?
Sarah.
Ditto.
Oh, okay, that was easy.
That's exactly what I was going to say. If you don't do the business, if you haven't got the qualifications, if you haven't got the people who know how to do it, how do you review what the AR has done, and how do you know whether what they've done is correct?
Yeah. So do you see the regulator turning up and saying, you can't have, you may be a reg host, you may have those, but you can't have that permission, you can't have that permission. You can be a reg host in that area in which you have the compliance skills. And by the way, we're going to review you very closely, as opposed to a principle where they're going, listen, you've got a compliance department that does compliance with treating customers fairly and putting them first and AML and KYC and sales appropriateness training and all the rest of it. And you've got some ARs that are down there. And if I was a principal, I'd be saying, listen, we don't want the cost. We want to be able to upscale and downscale our sales team. And we have to do that through ARs. But trust us. And I think that's probably going to be okay, isn't it?
I fall heavily on the side of the principal firm as a proper principal. They have the permissions, they do the work, they know what they're talking about. I don't know how a regulatory host can ensure compliance if they don't walk the walk, they can't do it.
Yeah. Again, I draw a line here between wholesale, where regulatory hosts effectively manage the trading relationship and they're an aggregator, and they probably can do a job in that space. And there are some very, very good ones out there that have been going for a long time and have proved to the regulator that they know what they're doing, as opposed to retail, where it's all a bit more cost competitive and there's a big asymmetry between the clients and between the reg hosts. So if you look into payments or credit, you can have fairly large consumer organizations that are wanting to sign people up to a interest-free credit environment, and you'll have a host that's sitting there saying, yeah, we'll make sure that business is okay. But the disparity in balance sheet is quite enormous in those environments, whereas in a principal, not so much.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, we see lots of inquiries still coming in from the APCC where firms are still looking for a regulatory umbrella. They don't want to go direct. They're not ready to go direct for whatever reason. So there's still a need for the model. And then also with reg hosts versus principal, do they know enough about the consumer duty? From a retail perspective, I'm talking.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't know the underlying non-product specific stuff, how are they going to monitor the AR's performance against the consumer duty? How are they going to make sure they're doing what they should be doing?
I think we're coming hard up on time. So if I can ask you both just for your final thoughts, suggestions, where you think the market's going, what you'd like to leave the audience as a final thought. Sarah, as you're up in the big window, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, happy to. I think the model will be staying around, at least for the next few years. There is a place for it. There is a need for it. The principal just has to make sure they're overseeing their population. The AR needs to be pulling their weight, following systems and controls in place. What we find is if they do try to go direct, they come unstuck very quickly because they don't understand what they need to have in place. They rely very heavily on these principles. The principal really does need to make sure that they've got the oversight in place. They need to know what's going on.
Cool. Shaz?
Yeah. I think what I would say is to be on the right side of the FCA and making sure you're compliant is to have intrusive compliance. Really get into the nitty and gritty of what your AR is doing and making sure you know exactly what they're doing, making sure there's a good training and support for ARs to understand and open that communication. And the FCA on a practical level said you need to have open communication channels in terms of emails, calls and meetings, and not just leaving communication to be an annual panic, making sure you're having regular engagement with your ARs so that you can have they may be more comfortable to just pick up the phone and go, do you know what, I'm not sure about something. Can we talk about this? And owning compliance, I think compliance needs to be owned 100% by the principal, because the regulatory burden and responsibility and risk lies there, and B, just because it makes sense with the charge and charging more to have that compliance in place. So either making sure you're investing in reg tech or human resources to make sure there is robust compliance in place. And if you don't have the internal expertise as a regulatory host, outsourcing that and utilizing third parties as part of that, your compliance structure and framework.
Lovely. So that just leaves me to thank both Sarah and Shaz for joining us on this panel. Personally, I think we could have done a whole nother hour, but I think we might lose our audience fairly quickly if we did. Thank you all very much for listening to us, and I look forward to another thought leader session. Maybe we do one on wholesale ARs next time, just to cover off that part of the market. But I thank you both, and I will see you all on the next session that we do. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Pat.